Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of engineering design and construction. Now they are decaying, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. Their empty buildings and infrastructures are full of the echoes of real people and vanished lives, leaving many questions unanswered and mysteries unsolved. In this episode, we dive into the past to find out how the largest mass scuttling of ships in history was linked with medical research and the space program.
One of these intriguing modern myths is that steel from them was extracted and used by NASA in the Voyager crafts, which were going out to the far reaches of the universe.
We ask why the US government spent millions on a fleet of steamships in World War I, then deliberately destroyed them.
If we're going to enter the war, we're going to need an awful lot of shipping. There's this extraordinary instruction that then goes out to create 1,300 feet wooden vessels that would do that job.
We find out why the ancestor of all modern warships came to be lying half submerged and forgotten on the far side of the world.
Australia's got 7,500 historic shipwrecks in its waters, but it's only got one of these from this incredible part of naval engineering. You know, this is the only ship in the world of this type.
And we board one of the survivors of the Cold War's underwater game of cat and mouse to find out how it could have caused World War III.
People don't realize just how close we came to World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Today, ships like the giant aircraft carriers operated by the US Navy are some of the largest man-made structures on the planet. Along with nuclear submarines, they allow America to deliver awesome power against targets all over the world. 150 years ago, the claim to be the world's most powerful warship went to a vessel that looked nothing like these high-tech wonders. But just like them, it was packed with the latest technology, and when it appeared, warfare at sea would change forever. Sitting unnoticed in shallow water in Half Moon Bay, Australia, lies one of the most important warships ever built. It's another example of what was once state-of-the-art engineering, now littering the oceans of the world. But this one is of particular historical importance.
Australia's got 7,500 historic shipwrecks in its waters, but it's only got one of these, only one monitor, one breastwork monitor from this incredible part of naval engineering. You know, this is the only ship in the world of this type.
Looking at her today, it's hard to believe that Her Majesty's Victorian ship Cerberus was ever a world leader. So what makes this battered wreck so significant? Tim Smith is Executive Director of the State Historical Authority, Heritage Victoria. He studied its fascinating story.
So the Cerberus was ordered and it was completed by 1870 and arrived here in Australia. So at the time it was spick and span. It was straight off the shipyard, and it was its first maiden voyage, longest voyage by one of these class of ships in history at the time.
HMS Cerberus, literally the guardian of the underworld, is a magnificent technology demonstrator. On a very small displacement, it packs the most powerful armament imaginable. It's seaworthy enough to get all the way to Australia from its building yard in Britain. And it means that anybody coming into the approaches to Melbourne Harbour is going to get sunk.
By the middle of the 19th century, wooden warships were starting to be replaced by ironclads like the famous HMS Warrior. Despite their iron hulls, these ships followed the traditional layout that had been used for centuries. Was it just that the tradition of Nelson died hard?
There's a wonderful old myth that naval officers were so hidebound and conservative that they want to stick to what Nelson had used at Trafalgar all the way through the 19th century. This simply isn't true. Naval officers are professionals, and going to sea in ships and fighting battles requires you to be skilled and proficient. They all wanted the latest and best technology. What they didn't want was experimental, unproven technology that might fail. So what they insisted on was making sure that it worked before they actually took it into battle.
Then, one crucial invention changed the way warships were built and fought each other forever. During the Crimean War, a British naval officer called Cowper Coles designed an armoured box for warship guns. When it was mounted on a turntable for all-round fire, it became the gun turret.
Now, the beauty of gun turrets is that you can rotate them pretty much 360 degrees, so you can fire in any direction. One at the front, one at the back of the ship, you're good to go. You can maneuver your firepower wherever you need it very, very quickly.
The technology of the turret itself is actually quite humdrum. It's just an armoured box sitting on top of the turntable that you find in any railway station where you turn the locomotive round. But that system transforms warship design because you can't combine it with a full sailing rig or indeed high freeboard. So you change the design of ships. That's the only way of getting two very big guns on a small platform of shallow draft. It's not designed to fight on the open ocean.
For me, that's a revolutionary time in the design of battleships, because that design with the two gun turrets, one at each end of the ship, lasted us then for, well, decades to come.
Incredibly, it was the state of Victoria in Australia that led the way in combining the turret with a new design of warship. Public subscription helped pay for a ship to defend them against invasion by Russia.
The willingness of people in the state of Victoria in Australia to put their hands in their pockets to pay out for this warship to protect themselves against Russian attack sounds a bit nutty on the surface, but actually there was a good reason why they did that, because in 1864 the Times reported that the Russian Pacific fleet, very much a danger to shipping, Allied shipping right across the Pacific, had actually received orders that in the event of war with Britain that might have broken out as a result of Britain's stance over the Polish revolt, would actually sail the fleet down to Australia and attack its ports, including Melbourne. And therefore, the purchase of the Cerberus, which was way ahead of its time in terms of military technology, this ironclad with quite powerful guns, would have played a very practical purpose, and that was to deter the Russians. And of course, we'll never know whether it actually would have served its purpose, because war never does break out. But it's not as mad a plan as it might seem at first sound.
What the citizens of Victoria wanted was a powerful warship to defend the approaches to the city of Melbourne. Work started in Britain on a new design called a breastwork monitor. With two 200-ton turrets, each carrying two 10-inch muzzle-loading guns, and a central armoured superstructure, she looked like no other fighting vessel.
Yeah, the Victorian government ordered this ship specially to defend this harbour. The construction began in 1867, and by 1870 the vessel was completely commissioned and ready to sail, arriving in Australia on the other side of the world. It was the longest voyage in history of this class of new capital ship, and a remarkable feat, but a harrowing journey.
Launched in 1868, the 3,000-ton ship was named Cerberus, after the terrifying triple-headed dog guarding the underworld in Greek mythology. Now she faced a 10,000-mile voyage from Britain to her new home in Australia.
Biggest challenge for the Cerberus came at the very, very start of its lifetime. Built in Britain for operation in Australia, a 10,000-mile journey across some of the most treacherous seas on the planet. To get it there, they actually took out the guns and shipped them over separately and filled the turrets with coal. Coal in every available space on this ship to try and make sure they had enough fuel to cover the 10,000 miles. But just in case they didn't have enough, what did they have on board? Just as a little bit of extra power? Masts and sails, reverting back to old technology. But it just goes to show how impressive this ship was and the engineers behind it. A ship that was only really designed ever to be 30, 40 miles away from a coastline. It's an impressive feat.
When she finally reached Melbourne, Cerberus settled into a peacetime role. The Russians never came, and her guns were never used in anger.
The ultimate purpose of any military expenditure is to preserve peace. Winning wars is a very secondary consideration because it's expensive and messy and you can't guarantee the outcome. Cerberus, like the nuclear deterrent today, worked very well. The Russians never came, peace was preserved, Port Phillip Head was never bombarded.
In her day, Cerberus was one of the most powerful warships out there and could easily have taken care of her contemporaries. As it happened, she never had to fire her guns in anger because the pace of technology picked up so quickly. The design of battleships moved on enormously within a couple of decades. You would never have got to where technology went, that naval technology went, without having Cerberus, without the design and engineering that went in to designing Cerberus. She was part of that iterative process to get to the World War I battleships.
By the end of the First World War, the Cerberus had long outlived her usefulness. So what can you do with 3,000 tons of iron and steel from another era?
The Cerberus was lucky that it survived because it had been mothballed in Melbourne, the port of Melbourne, for many years, and that saved it really. And then the opportunity came to sink the vessel, obtain the vessel and scuttle it here as a breakwater, and really to protect the coastal erosion. So the defender of the harbour became the defender of the coastline.
Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands is one of the world's best natural harbours. It was here, during World War I, that the direct descendants of the Cerberus design could be seen in greater numbers than anywhere else on Earth. Scapa was the home of the battleships of Britain's mighty Grand Fleet. The last few decades has seen a surge in the popularity of sports diving. Many divers head to the far north of Scotland, to one of the world's largest natural harbours. Its freezing waters and limited visibility are not for everyone.
I think to swim just around the, maybe as you might describe, the tourist route, I still see new things every time I dive. And then inside the ships, well, it's all still there. It's there to explore and discover, and there are, certainly in the battleships, which are so big, you can have the privilege of being places that nobody's walked down that corridor for 100 years.
War has always pushed engineering to its limits, and war at sea is no exception. In the early 20th century, the latest advances in engineering were all combined into a single weapon system, the battleship.
Around the turn of the 20th century, it was the battleship that was the culmination of success and progress in so many areas of engineering. In propulsion, steam turbines were being used on these great big ships. Advancements in communication and optics, firepower, the size of guns you could have, all came together in these amazing war machines that almost became status symbols for any navy. If you didn't have one, who were you?
Throughout the First World War, Scapa was home to dozens of Britain's battleships. And when the fighting stopped in November 1918, the German high seas fleet was brought here to be interned. Emily Turton is a Scapa Flow dive master and an expert on what happened to these once feared German ships.
Scapa Flow is surrounded by the southern Isles of Orkney, creating this huge natural harbour, this enormous natural harbour that you can see behind me and all around us, which becomes the best place strategically to house the bulk of our navy, both in the First World War and the Second World War. Now, the German Navy in the First World War, I imagine, didn't really want Scapa Flow to be so important to them, but it ends up being where the bulk of their navy is their final resting place.
For 6 months, the German ships anchored under British guns, while the Allies thrashed out the terms of the peace treaty with Germany. But on June the 21st, 1919, the German skeleton crews took matters into their own hands.
Admiral von Reuter wasn't being kept informed, really up to date with the peace negotiations. He fully expects that the German fleet will be seized and that they will be divvied up among the Allied forces, which I believe was the intention. He can't do anything to prevent that while these fighting ships haven't been disarmed. He has no way of fighting back, so his only remaining act of war, the only option he has open to him, is to sink them so that nobody can have them.
The death of the high seas fleet was the largest mass scuttling in history. 52 ships, ranging from the latest 27,000-ton battleships to 600-ton destroyers, sank to the bottom of Scapa Flow.
The Germans picked a good day to scuttle. The British fleet that was still based in Scapa, much diminished, had gone off for battle practice. So there were very few ships left in harbour, which meant there were very few crews, very few boats. They couldn't get over to all the German ships to try and stop them doing what they were doing. Another day, there would have been a whole battle squadron there, which would have outnumbered the Germans in manpower and might have kept more of the ships afloat.
Master Mariner Nigel James is an expert on salvage and wreck recovery.
All vessels have what we refer more commonly to as a sea chest now. The sea chest is located in the engine room, and it's where the vessel takes water in for running the engine room systems, ballasting the vessel, getting water into the vessel's ballast tanks. And the pipes are huge. I mean, the pipes are sort of this sort of diameter. You know, you couldn't put your arms around them, the main sea chest inlets. If you wanted to scuttle a vessel, you would open the sea chest valves, and then you would open other valves into the system. So just let the water flood in throughout the ship would achieve the negative buoyancy that you needed to sink it.
The scuttling of the high seas fleet in 1919, I mean, an extraordinary event involving a massive number of warships, has been relatively forgotten because, at least from the British perspective, we're a little bit embarrassed about it because we didn't manage to prevent it. We'd actually like to have got our hands on those ships, and the German captain, the German admiral and his captains were able to really, in some ways, in their view, save their honour by sinking their own ships rather than handing them over. So it's not a terribly glorious episode, and it has, of course, also been overshadowed by many of the land battles, appalling as they were.
One man was determined not to leave 400,000 tons of metal and machinery to rot on the seabed. Ernest Cox was an engineer with no experience of salvage at sea. But in 1920, he began attempting the impossible.
Engineering is about problem solving, fundamentally. The problem that Ernest Cox was faced with was how to raise 52 sunken warships from the bottom of the ocean and get them back onto land. Warships of all sizes and shapes, right up to battleships weighing 26,000 tons.
Ernest Cox, often known as the man who bought a fleet, is one of those rare individuals who's prepared to take a long shot on a big gamble. There's a lot of money lying on the bottom of Scapa Flow, but he really doesn't know how to get it back up onto the surface and get it into a shipyard to cut it up for scrap.
They wouldn't have had the same huge lifting capacity that we have these days. They would have had to look at air. If you can regain the watertight integrity of a vessel and introduce air into it, it is possible to refloat it. You would have to have a reasonably intact vessel.
One of Cox's techniques used salvage components from smaller ships to bring their larger sisters to the surface.
An example of Ernest Cox's ingenuity was how he used boilers from some of the ships that had already been salvaged to create these enormous airlocks that went from the level of the sea surface where the salvaged ships were, and to create these giant tubes by welding them all together to create an airlock right down to the bottom of the sea where the scuttled hull, where the scuttled ship was sitting.
In the 20s and 30s, it was their scrap value that made metals recovered from the sunken German ships worth salvaging. But in 1945, another, even more powerful weapon system led to a new use for the remains of the high seas fleet.
A bizarre twist in the tale and a probably completely unexpected outcome is how armor used to protect yesterday's super weapons, the battleships, against the biggest blast they could have had at the time, was now being used to analyze the effectiveness and the effect of the next generation of super weapon, the nuclear weapons.
Any steel that was manufactured before the first nuclear explosion has a much lower radiation signature than modern steels made with an irradiated atmosphere, because huge amounts of air are sucked into the process of high-grade steelmaking. So if you're measuring radiation, the last thing you want is equipment that is already itself heavily irradiated. So this steel, which has been underwater since 1919, is actually very useful for that purpose.
Doctors now needed a way to test radiation levels in the human body that would not be compromised by the higher background radiation.
I mean, it's testament to the quality of the German steel that it would later be so useful for radiation experiments in hospitals. Only really high-grade steel, and particular steel before the first atomic weapon had been exploded in 1945, could be used in that way. But of course, the German creators of this wonderful metal would never have imagined that that would be the ultimate purpose. They imagined it would be for the glory of Germany, and a very different purpose has actually happened.
Mallows Bay lies on the other side of the Atlantic, near Washington, D.C. There, in just a few feet of water, the remains of another First World War fleet can clearly be seen today. The Potomac is one of America's most historic rivers and a major water highway leading to Washington, D.C. But many people living along its banks have no idea that it hides all that is left of a disastrous plan that cost the USA millions of dollars. The ghost fleet of Mallows Bay.
We're in Mallows Bay, which is 30 miles south of Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River. It's a small embayment about half a mile wide and absolutely stuffed with World War I wooden vessels, steamships. There are probably 130 or so vessels in this area, of which the vast majority, 100 or so, are these World War I vessels.
When the USA entered the First World War in April 1917, her factories had been producing equipment for the Allies for 2 years. Now, they were faced with the task of equipping America's own forces.
Was the U.S. prepared when it entered World War I? No, not really. I mean, the reality is, their industry was at full capacity, making armaments for the Allies.
The entire American industrial base had been turned over to supply munitions to the British, the French, and the Russians. The Americans had no spare capacity, and they certainly weren't ready to fight.
they were really challenged. They couldn't keep up with sending supplies to the Allies in Europe, and it was a real problem.
If we're going to enter the war and not only get supplies over to the Allies, but also our own soldiers, we're going to need an awful lot of shipping. So how much shipping do we actually have? Well, as it turned out, not enough, because there's this extraordinary instruction that then goes out to create 1,300 feet wooden vessels that would do that job.
The result was one of the greatest shipbuilding projects in history. Maryland State underwater archaeologist Susan Langley is an expert on this extraordinary story.
With the advent of World War I, there was a proposal made to come up with something like 2 million tons of shipping in 18 months. So this was a phenomenal proposition. They wanted to build 1,000 of these wooden steamships. They were not military vessels. It was a civilian endeavor. There were support vessels. The problem was they were 270 to 300 feet long. They could only do about 10 knots maximum, so they were vulnerable. They were not fast. They were largely expendable, so if you're facing U-boat action, you'd rather lose a wooden hull quickly built to a metal hull, although we certainly didn't want to lose the supplies. It was keeping the economic supply chain open that was critical to get those supplies to the Allies overseas.
The steel foundries and major shipyards of America were already pushed to their limit. Ordering 1,000 steamships was asking the impossible. The US government had no choice but to take a step back to the construction techniques of a previous era.
In 1917, the American steel shipbuilding is not a very large industry. So the Americans see the quick way of building ships is to go back to the craft industry and build in wood. Put steam engines in them, but build in wood because that's going to be quicker than trying to set up new steel shipbuilding centers.
There were 8 basic designs that were issued, and every shipyard kind of tweaked them based on their own mastery of it. You know, we knew in 1917 when the war was going to end. It wasn't in the foreseeable future, so 18 months was extremely expeditious to try and get 2 million tons of shipping out in 18 months to answer a badly needed call.
Contracts for building this giant wooden fleet went out to 87 boat builders across America. The project was hailed as a unique and war-winning triumph for American construction. But it soon became obvious the boatyards just weren't up to the job.
I think this sudden need to create 1,000 ships from an industry, a marine industry, that really isn't geared up for this does smack of desperation.
They built them very fast. They had problems with green timber. They had problems with them leaking. They had problems with vibrations. You'll see there are large blocks of concrete. These were added to help stabilize the vessels. They were patchwork, if you will.
The shipyards that they go to aren't big enough. They don't have the resources. Many of them have lost their ability to build ships effectively in the previous few years. So the industry that in 1900 was still fairly dynamic is on its last legs. A lot of men have gone off to other crafts and other trades.
They are asking people who really simply don't have the means, the tools, and the expertise to do a job that's probably beyond them. And so it proves, because by the end of the First World War, not a single one of those 1,000 ships, only about 130 of them have been delivered, but not a single one has actually been used for transporting either men or materials across the Atlantic, which was the original purpose.
Alterations and improvements to the ships meant that they were costing an incredible $1 million each. And the whole program had fallen way behind schedule. Costs began to spiral out of control. Incredibly, it was nearly a year after the end of the war before the United States government finally cancelled the wooden fleet, leaving it with more than 200 unwanted ships. Thousands of dollars were being spent just keeping them afloat. There was only one thing to do.
The majority of them were moored across the river near an area called Widewater, and they'd take a few at a time up to Alexandria to have them broken down for the metal components. Some of the wood, mostly the metal. But because of storms and fires, every time there was a problem, they'd break loose, they'd become hazards to navigation, they'd sail downstream. So they tied them all together, burned them to the water line, stuffed them into the bay, filled them with rocks, and then put posts along the front to keep them here. I think the largest burn was 30 ships at once.
The whole project ended up being a grand example of what happens when you go into something completely unprepared, make hasty decisions, and throw lots of money at it. It's a classic modern democratic government problem.
So we have 1,000 wooden ships commissioned at $1 million apiece. Is that American can do or American should not have? Today, they're an ecosystem for wildlife. But what is that? That's the most expensive nature reserve in history.
The disaster story that turned Mallows Bay into a scrapyard had become an extraordinary and unexpected success. The background to the ships that lie here is now almost forgotten, but it deserves its place in US history. In southern England, in the town of Rochester, there is proof that it's not just useless wooden steamers that pose a disposal problem. It's an unlikely home for a class of Soviet warship that 50 years ago almost ignited World War III. For hundreds of years, the River Medway was home to Britain's Royal Navy, so warships of all kinds were just part of the scenery. But when the former Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine B-49 arrived near the small town of Rochester in 2003, it was a first. John Sutton is responsible for this incredible Cold War relic.
This is the forward torpedo room of B-49, and this is one of 22 torpedoes that it could have carried, mainly high explosive warheads, but they did have a nuclear tip torpedo capability, but they didn't always carry those.
The Cold War is often seen as a time when nuclear missiles and thousands of tanks were lined up, waiting for the go code. What is often forgotten is that at sea, the opposing sides were often eyeball to eyeball.
When we talk about the Cold War, we often imagine everybody sitting still in a fur coat. In fact, a very large amount is happening. We know there's a covert war in the air. We know the Americans are spying over Russia. But everybody is using submarines to creep into each other's backyards and do a bit of intercept and spying. The British and the Americans are spying on the Russians. The Russians are trying to pick them up and stop them spying. There's a lot going on under the water. So the submarine is in many ways the iconic warship of the Cold War because it's the most active. It's the one you can use without leaving a visible trace.
Submarines became the major striking arm of the Soviet fleet. But while the US and British navies wanted all nuclear-powered submarine forces, the USSR continued to use traditional diesel-electric boats, like the B-49.
The Soviet approach to their submarine warfare was very much a case of, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the Soviet kept their diesel powered because they did the job. You know, they got to where they needed to be, albeit not at the greatest level of comfort at all. You'd be so cramped down inside these machines with these three great big locomotive diesel engines going off 24/7 all the time. The noise and the smells must have just been awful down there.
You know, many have wondered why the USSR kept building this outdated technology right up until the 1980s, this Foxtrot class of subs. You know, surely there's new technology they could bring to bear. There is, but they have a manufacturing line that's just churning out quantity over quality. And that's what it's all about. They're using what they know because it's all about numbers. Sure, they can innovate, but why would you change when you've got a good thing going?
So you would call it the workhorse, you know, the sort of larder version of a submarine. It was just a pretty basic submarine, but still enough of a threat to worry and keep the Americans and NATO busy looking for them and keep track of them because they knew they still had nuclear capability if they had to have them. So whilst they weren't the most glamorous, they were still a very potent weapon for Russia.
The problem with the conventional diesel-powered submarine was that it couldn't stay underwater for extended periods.
The Foxtrot class would stay submerged for around 2 days, possibly 3, but by then they'd be really pushing the limits of their batteries to stay submerged. They could snorkel, and meaning they could come just below the surface and run their engines to charge the batteries, but they'd easily be spotted by a plane because they'd only be 4 meters below the surface. It'd be quite easy for a plane to spot them if they're doing that.
This weakness of the Foxtrot-class submarines became a crucial factor when 4 of them were sent to confront the US Navy during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarines that are in the Caribbean are Foxtrot-class boats, and the Americans do not pick up all of the Foxtrots that are out in the Atlantic. They pick up 2 and force them to surface by basically sitting over the top of them until they run out of breathable air. But the other 2 managed to sneak through.
Aboard the hunted Foxtrots, conditions soon became unbearable as both air and power began to run out.
You know, the Russians really did design these as a war machine. They didn't design them for the crew to be having a little pleasant cruise anywhere. The heat and the smells and the humidity would have been quite unbearable. Depending on which oceans they're in, obviously it gets worse, but not a pleasant experience.
They were so claustrophobic. You had 1 bathroom, 2 showers, 74 men. You can imagine after a few days how disgusting that is. I mean, it's a miracle they can make these long journeys across the Atlantic at all. It mystifies me.
Your personal space wouldn't be very much more than the immediate space around you. It's no wonder that after a certain amount of time, that would start to get to you. And you might start to just lose your mind a little bit. Your judgment might not be as clear, and you'd be extremely stressed. These were the conditions that those Soviet crewmen were in.
Unknown to the US forces, the Foxtrots were carrying torpedoes with nuclear warheads. Out of touch with Moscow and uncertain if a war had already broken out, one Soviet captain was ready to launch.
People don't realize just how close we came to World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US was dropping depth charges, testing out their capability onto Russian subs down below. Now, these Russian subs had been in the water for a long time, and one of them in particular was captained by a chap who, he was just starting to lose it.
Well, because they were under orders not to communicate with Russia, they had no way of knowing what really was going on. But they knew from radio signals they could pick up bits and pieces that there was a lot going on the surface, and people were looking for them. The one captain was a bit trigger happy and was all ready to fire his nuclear-tipped torpedo.
He's been down under the ocean for way too long. He thinks World War III must have started, so he goes to press the button to send a nuclear warhead to the US naval ships. And his colleague says, no, hang on, you can't do that. You can't do that, stop. So if there ever was an unsung hero, it would have to be that guy who stopped his commander from starting World War III.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1989, hundreds of unwanted warships began clogging the shipwrecking yards of the world, creating a looming environmental disaster.
These had to be disposed of properly, in a very thoughtful way. Otherwise, it's an environmental disaster waiting to happen.
Modern warships are full of truly appalling things. Second World warships full of asbestos, diesel oil, and it just gets worse and worse.
Yes, it might cost more than just taking it to a scrap heap and chopping it up and being done with it. But otherwise, the cost to the environment and to the Earth, who knows where that could go.
Decaying nuclear submarines posed a particular problem with their radioactive contamination. But even ordinary diesel subs were packed with a lethal cocktail of contaminants. Simply dumping them at sea was not an option. And the safety record of Soviet-built naval vessels made this all too obvious.
Of course, you have to remember that the Russian submarine is one of the more dangerous instruments of the Cold War. The first Russian nuclear submarine killed most of its own crew, and the Kursk famously killed all of its crew. The Russians were able to build and operate these vessels, but their safety standards were not always as high as they might have been. And the Soviets and later the Russians were quite happy to cover these things up as far as they could get away with it. So going to sea in a Russian submarine is not really a very attractive proposition.
Though the B-49 looks almost completely derelict, its current owner is carrying out restoration work so that it can be turned into a tourist attraction. By contrast, the Mallows Bay Ghost Fleet has already become a unique maritime resource. An archaeological site, nature reserve, and recreational centre, all in one. But the ships built so quickly a century ago won't last forever.
It's got to be in the top 5 of environmental and historical enclaves. There may not be a cross-section of ships, but because of the story they tell and because of the tribute they pay to the merchant marine, now that they've become this integral part of the environment, where you've got both of these aspects, and where it's going to continue into the future to be this sort of linchpin into an environmental living laboratory for the future.
Sadly, it's already too late for the Cerberus to become a tourist attraction. But her wreck has become the focus of maritime preservation.
Heritage Victoria has been leading archaeological surveys of this wreck for a number of decades now, so we're trying to piece together the history of the craft through archaeological surveys. That's included surveys on the exterior of the vessel and also remote vehicle surveys of the interior. We are learning every time we look at this vessel more about the design, the fit out, and just the ways that they actually crafted the hull and its amazing ability to sink, to lower its freeboard, and the technology of the guns and the armament. There's so much to learn from the original ship.
In the cold waters of Scapa Flow, the 7 remaining wrecks of the High Seas Fleet attract sport divers from all over the world. But there are stories that steel from their vanished sister ships is making a last, incredible voyage.
One of these intriguing modern myths about the German battleships sunk around the Orkneys is that steel from them was extracted and used by NASA in the Voyager crafts, which were going out to the far reaches of the universe.
The idea that a piece of the High Seas Fleet is winging its way to the edge of the solar system might sound slightly bizarre, but obsolete technologies which have purposes which have been long since finished may end up being reused to do other things. And it's not the only time that a piece of heavy naval ordnance has been used to get into space.
It may all be a myth, but the German engineers who built these ships so long ago might have liked the idea that their hard work would play a part in mankind's greatest voyage. The journey to the stars.